into the chat if you wish to. We may answer questions throughout the morning, or we might just wait until the end or throughout the session. I've already put into the chat function an attendance form. If you would please fill in the form. You only need to fill it in once. I'll probably repeat it throughout the session, but just fill it in once, just to confirm your attendance at this event, because the Microsoft Teams doesn't necessarily record which student has attended. At the end of the session, Diane is going to put in an evaluation form, and obviously from our point of view, it is good to hear from you if the session met your needs, if we should be doing something different, to give us an idea of how you actually, felt about the session. On this occasion and for this semester, there's also the opportunity of being in a draw for a £25 shopping voucher. I don't know where that shopping voucher is for. I've just been told there's a £25 shopping voucher, but that's reasonable too. Okay, so this short session sits into what we are putting on as employability skill sessions. And if you've been on our website, you'll have seen this symbol, I suppose, that we use, or a summary of the employability skills. And these are skills that we look at as ones that are transferable for use in, the vast majority of jobs that are out there. So any job that you're going for, any interview that you're going to be doing, you're going to want to be able to talk about most of these skills. So this particular session, I have it under problem solving, but to be honest, because it's a transferable skill, thinking creatively could come up in almost any one of those labels. Basically, it could come under leadership, it could come under communication skills, information technology, lots of different ones there. So, it is a transferable skill. So the course structure then today, what is creativity? So what are we actually talking about whenever we think of creativity? I'm going to give you some ideas about strengthening what I call your creative muscles. We'll look at creative thinking tools. I think we've 6 creative thinking tools to look at. That's not all of them by any means, but ones that I think are sort of quick and easy to use. And we'll finish off the session, and the session will probably only last about 45 minutes or so. But we'll finish off with creativity at interview. Now, you may not be asked specifically about creativity when you're at an interview. Indeed, it's unlikely that you will be, but you will be asked about things like problem solving, about things like when have you been able to deal with change, things like that. So you will be able to draw on your knowledge of creative thinking to be able to answer some of those questions. But, this is about being able to widen your creative thinking and then having some idea about the actual topic so that you can bring forward your thinking at interview. Okay, so what do we mean by creativity then? I think that often a lot of people see creativity as being artistic, and it's not about that entirely. This is about thinking creatively. So creativity is generating new and useful ideas in any domain. Now, to some extent, I would question the word useful there, because I think that, creativity in itself is useful. You don't necessarily have to have an end result. Thinking creatively generates more creativity. So, although I'm keeping that word useful in there, and if you're talking about developing products or ideas or systems or anything, then certainly useful is a good word to have in there. But it's all about sort of making the impossible possible. So using thinking creative skills to be able to widen your thinking and do things differently. So, are you creative? If we were doing this in a live session, in the good old days, if we'd been sitting in a lecture room, I'd probably be saying to you, oh, okay, everyone put up your hands, everybody that is creative. And you may not all put your hands up, because it's one of those things that as we get older, we're more likely to sort of say, no, I'm not very creative. If I'd asked you whenever you were in, say, primary one at school, if, as a 4 or 5 year old, if I'd asked a class of 4 or 5 year olds to say, put up your hands, who's creative? Probably every one of them would have done that. But as we get older, we start to sort of feel, we lose that element of playfulness. We use that element of using our imagination. And we also tend to be trained towards thinking more critically. So I suppose what this session is all about as well is about trying to maintain that level of, using your imagination and seeing yourself as creative. Because if you can come away from this session today and answer the question, yes, I am creative, then I'd be, I think that this was a success. Basically, I'd be very happy with that. So remember, if at the end I say to you, are you creative? All hands up. Okay, so creative thinking and critical thinking. And as we move through our school years and our university years, we do tend to be taught to think more critically than creatively. And by that, I mean, that we're asked to be focused about our thinking, that we sort of narrow it down rather than expand it, that we look at the probability of things happening, that we're analytical, and that we tend to look for the answer, one right answer, rather than to look for answers, a range of answers. With creative thinking, then, you are sort of looking at being diffuse, to looking at a variety of thinking, not trying to narrow it and focus it down. You're looking at possibilities, and when you say the word possibility there, it's endless. It can be, getting your thinking to be very big, to generate new ideas. The next word there is generative. And you're looking for an answer, or possibly a range of answers, not necessarily the answer. Now, obviously, that's not fitting in with the science. If you're looking at doing a research paper or something like that, you want to be looking for focus. You want to be looking at what can be proven and what can be repeated. But in the early days, whenever you're thinking about what can I be doing, how can I be doing it, then, think of things in a creative way rather than in a typically sort of narrow and focused way. Okay, so we can put up barriers to our own creativity, not just with our mindset, but with the environment as well that we work in. So if you think about it in terms of our mindset, you know, as I said to you, as we get older, we tend to sort of think, yeah, I'm not a very creative person. What would happen if I make a mistake, or what would happen if I fail? I'm not somebody that likes change, and you know what? It's just too risky. Okay, so we tend to put those things into our own mindset. And then whenever we go into sort of a work environment, it may be the case that, you know, you start to feel that you just don't have time to think. You certainly would hear occasionally you're not paid to think, depending on what your work environment is, of course. And, you know, also, especially because people at work tend to be extremely busy, and they know what they have to get done, and they use their time just to get that done. So it's hard to sort of expand and say, yeah, well, how could we do it differently? We've always done it this way. It's too risky to do it another way, is often the sort of mindset. And also, if it works, it works. Why would we change it? Okay, so there's barriers there to creativity within your own mindset, and often within the organization as well. So often whenever companies say we want people to be really creative, they don't necessarily create the environment to allow that to happen. But that's not necessarily something that, you know, you can manage within that environment, but it is something that you can work with yourself if you're aware of it, and if you know that you need to do something to be creative yourself. Because some people will really not be happy in a job where they can't be creative. Okay, so whenever we start to think about opening our minds to being creative, one of the things that I would say to start with would be a blank page. So I think that, you have to give yourself time to be creative. And you might not like to hear this, but that probably means not constantly scrolling through Instagram or Pinterest or whatever the trendy social media things are at the minute. I don't mean that you can't be inspired by other people's creativity, because you certainly can be whenever you look at things that other people are doing. But I think for you to be creative yourself, you have to give yourself a time out to be able to think your own thoughts and give yourself an opportunity to be creative and to come up with something. So to open your mind to being creative. And as I said, to my mind, that means giving yourself a time out, giving yourself a blank slate, a blank page to be able to do that. So, it might be take a walk, certainly when you're allowed to, or lie in a bath, or stare at a blank page, or whatever it might be to give yourself room to be creative. Okay, so that's the first thing. Challenge your own assumptions. So, always ask yourself if something has to be this way, or could it be different? What are the assumptions that you have, and what you could change, what you could be, how would you think differently about it? Stay curious. That young age where we ask why, and we get away from that, and that's part of that sort of narrower thinking. But staying curious is one of those things that will really expand your ability to be creative, to think creatively, and also it is good for your well-being. But that's another session, so we'll not go down that road. Stay curious is one of the ways of keeping your mind open to thinking creatively. And play, don't lose the art and the joy of play. So, rediscover that joy of getting out the Lego or the colouring pencils or whatever else that you feel is, getting creative. Because again, just like thinking differently, we tend to lose that sort of time where it's okay to just use your imagination to be playful. I've been training for many years, and at the beginning, whenever I would be, training with people, I would have sort of been a little bit offended, I suppose, to see people sitting doodling while I was trying to give them some words of wisdom. And, now I'm very aware that actually sitting doodling is a good way of keeping your mind open. I'm not saying that that doesn't mean that the people weren't bored, but it is a way of keeping your mind open and keeping your senses, I suppose, stimulated to be able to think, to make patterns in your head, and to be able to continue to sort of take on board information. So play is a really useful way of expanding your creativity. Try new ways of doing things. So, that idea of doing things the same way all of the time will not open you up to being creative. So it might be as simple as, trying a new recipe every week. It might be learning a new function on some sort of software package or something like that. It could be trying a new way to memorize things. Just try and keep doing new things, new and different things. So keep trying new ways of doing things. And this picture is really to show about working with creative people. So I've said to you, give yourself a time out and a blank page to be able to think your own thoughts. But I also do think that it is good to be able to work with other creative people, because it is great to be able to bounce ideas off other people and to sort of have other people help you expand your imagination as well. So just like, a couple of children playing with something, things can get bigger and more complicated, more detailed because others are involved. So, and it's not all about Lego, of course. But yeah, so working with creative people can be a good way of expanding your creative thinking as well. Okay, so let's look at some of the strategies for building your creative muscle then, because I genuinely do think that if you practice this, if you work on this, that you do actually become better at creative thinking. And some of the sort of theory around that is about the brain creating new ideas, new associations. So making new patterns. Whenever you come up with associations and you create links and you make patterns, your brain continues to do that. Your brain learns from that, and it encourages your brain to be able to make new associations with practice. So it's like anything else, whenever you learn a new instrument or something like that, something that's hard at the beginning, it gets better and easier with practice. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of practice. One of the things that isn't easy, and well, I suppose I say easy, but gets easier thing to do to expand your creative thinking is something called conceptual thinking. And here I've given you 8 pictures, and what I would ask you to do is just to think of a concept to pair them up. So come up with 4 pairs. The concept is entirely down to you. I'm going to give you a minute to do it, and it'll be very hard for me to keep quiet for a minute, but that's what I'm going to do. If there's no right or wrong answers, by the way, it's entirely up to you what the concept is that connects these pairs. If you would like to, you can put some of them into the chat. If you put the pair in, make sure and tell us what the concept is, and it'll be very interesting to see if we get any good or interesting ones. But as I say, not right or wrong ones. So I'm going to keep quiet for a minute and give you time to do that. Okay, don't know if there's anything gone into the chat or not, but
Roisin, do you want me to just share a couple of things that came in?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have the car and the horse power. So
Okay.
horsepower, the car and paint, both red.
Yeah.
And the pencil and the paint pot are both icons or functions in Photoshop, which I would never have got.
Very good.
The horse and the car, both transport.
Yeah.
That's all we have at the minute. So those are good. The only one I could think of was the typewriter and the pencil. You can both write with. They were the only connections I could get. We've got the cake and the hen, both tasty.
You can use eggs to make a cake.
Yeah, we've got the typewriter and the pencil as well. Yeah.
One of my favorite ones that somebody on a course with me did was the hen and the red paint pot, because she said the hen was for the paint pot was for painting the town red, and the hen and the paint pot represented a hen night. So I thought that was quite a good one. But as I say, it is all about what your concept is, and it's about creating patterns with the objects. And yes, it's a bit of fun, but it is about getting your brain practiced in making those sort of patterns. Because if you can make patterns in this sort of way, then whenever you're faced with other problems, the patterns become, it's much more normal for your brain to think in patterns then. So that's a pairing one. This next one's a bit harder, and I'm not really, obviously start to think about it. I'll put these two sets of pictures into the chat at the end, by the way, for any of you that might be interested in taking more time to look at it. But this is one, yes, you can start with pairing, but then what you could start to do is to see if you could put it into two groups of four. So, what would link four of the pictures together and what would link the other four? And that, it becomes much more difficult. But again, it's up to you what that concept is. It can be as narrow or as wide as you want it to be, basically. So you might come up with, for example, that four of the things are living things, okay? Other four aren't. And for those of you that have been thinking that and thought, oh no, she's come up with mine. Yes, I've had a while to look at these pictures. What they also suggest is that whenever you come up with those, then start to think of more. And I have to tell you, it gets hard. It does get hard. Whenever you think you've got an answer and they say, right, now do it again and come up with another one. But that's all about expanding your thinking, becoming more creative and looking for patterns, creating patterns and, making those concepts. So I'll move on. I'll not give you time for doing that one. As I said, I'm going to put it into the chat. So you'll have a chance if you want to spend time on it. Another one that is easy to come by and easy to use is a random word generator. And so you can just Google this. I'm sure there's apps for it as well. But it's one of the things that if you really wanted to sort of spend time practicing your thinking, your creative thinking skills, then this is an easy way to do it because you could do it every day or do it in a tea break or something like that. So basically you get, 3 or more random words and you come up with what links them together. And again, it's about what pattern you see, what concept that you can come up with. It isn't about what's a right or wrong. And it would be really interesting to see if you were doing it. Did you get quicker at coming up with things? I remember doing this in a training session myself, and the trainer had put up, 3 words, and nobody in the class got any of it at all. Nobody could come up with something that linked the 3 words. And I remember later during the tea break that I suddenly come up with a really good linking word, a really good concept. And it was a bit late for the actual course, but it did make me think that, whenever your mind isn't thinking about it, or specifically focused on it, it can be really good because it can still come up with things. So that's, just an example of not quite a eureka moment, but it certainly was something that even after actually focusing and thinking about the words, my brain was clearly still ticking over and thinking about it. Okay, so that's a random word generator, and as I say, you can easily Google those, or probably there's an app for them as well. So what I, was speaking to you about there was about how to, I suppose, open your mind, open your thinking to allow yourself to be more creative. These next few things, 6 things here, are creative thinking tools. Now, quite a few of them you'll probably have come across before because they're the sort of things like brainstorming, for example, that you probably would do in some teamwork and things that you'd be involved in. There are also things that would be quite, I suppose, familiar in the world of work when you are asked to sort of do things creatively. So it's worth getting to know them. You're not likely to be asked about a specific technique at interview. I don't know. It depends on what you go for, obviously. But it's worth knowing them. It's worth making some use of them as well, whether it's within your own, the teams perhaps that you have to work in, if, as part of your course. Some of them are easier to work as individuals, and some of them you will need, a few people for. But let's just go through them one at a time. So mind mapping, you probably are well aware of. Here's a nice one here, an example used for how to focus in the age of distraction. So basically you're starting with a central focus. You get your page, you put it landscape, and you put whatever your topic is into the middle of it. So that's your central focus. You use branches of that then for the main themes. And then you just, I suppose, keep going further and keep getting smaller. So you use colour and pictures, and I suppose that is where it's useful to have an artistic rather than a creative bent. And you add detail and you keep going until, I suppose, you run out of ideas or you have enough there. And it's probably around those outer edges of the page that your most creative thinking is likely to be. Okay, so it's just one sort of technique. It could be used in a group, or you could do that yourself. A lot of people use it for note taking. Personally, I'm not a big fan of it for note taking, but it can be useful. Also useful for revision, but this, is for thinking creatively, and it's all part and parcel of the same thing. Second one then, brainstorming and brainwriting. Again, you've probably at least done some brainstorming, if not brainwriting. The thing about brainstorming is that all ideas are equal, all ideas are valid, and they're not challenged, not at the time whenever you're being asked to do the brainstorm. Yes, they're challenged afterwards, certainly whenever you actually have to come up with a solution. But whenever you're brainstorming, everybody should be able to put up anything at all that they think about. But that in itself can have, I suppose, can be a bit inhibiting. You may be sitting there with your boss or senior managers. You may be there with, maybe a couple of people that are much louder and more vocal than other people. So maybe somebody who's quieter might not get their ideas up there. And as well as that, you might have, I suppose, somebody who comes up with an idea early on and leads everybody down that path. Essentially, that's what you focus on early on. So another creative thinking technique is brainwriting. And it's very similar, but instead of, you're given the question or the problem to come up with ideas for, but instead of shouting them all out, everybody writes out their ideas first of all on post-its or something like that, so that all the ideas are out there first, and you're sort of not dealing with the same inhibiting factors. And so then everybody can put up their ideas, and then you can start to, to look at what might work, what could work differently, and that kind of thing. So brainstorming and brainwriting, both quite good, both probably something that you will use at some point if you haven't already. It's a very popular thing, whether you call it brainstorming or not, it's a very popular thing to do. Okay, Scamper is a wee bit different, and one that I think is actually very useful, and it's an easy one to remember, that Scamper. So the premise basically is that everything new is really just an addition to or a modification of something that already exists. So it's based on, I suppose, the idea that whatever you want to change, there's already something there, so you're not reinventing the wheel, basically. So say you have a product, that you're working in a company or you're in a team in one of the schools or something, you've got a product that you want to make changes to. Either you want to improve it or you want to be able to use it in different ways. So you'd use this Scamper technique to expand your thinking about it. So S, substitute. Substitute something that's part of the product. C, combine with something else. Example I'll give you there is, I've seen recently advertisements on the TV for coffee bags, and clearly they've just combined coffee with tea bags and come up with coffee bags. So there's your very simple, example of combine to make a new product. Another one that I particularly, sometimes when I have a cold, I'm very happy about, is whenever someone thought to combine balm with tissues and came up with those nice soft tissues. So again, it's just somebody having the idea of, right, here we have something, now what can we do to make it different? So the third one there, adapt something to it. magnify or add to it. So modify it or minify it. So it could be that you take something away from it as well. Put it to other uses. So we use it for this. What else could we use it for? Eliminate something or reverse it. It's doing this now. What could it do instead? Scamper is one of those things that certainly with a product or a service or a system could be an easy way to come up with lots of different elements of how you could make changes to it. Something that, you could sort of typically see them using in something like The Apprentice or something along those lines. And then this is just the same thing again, Scamper, but even combining that with something like the brainwriting. So for each of the different things, combine or adapt, everybody puts up what their ideas might be around that. And then that's a good way of getting lots of ideas together. Okay, so that's Scamper. And Lawbreaker. And this, and I suppose I've already mentioned it whenever we were talking about opening yourself up to being creative. Lawbreaker is basically looking at challenging assumptions, because we get used to things being done in certain ways. We get used to the look of things. And this is about, all right, well, does it have to be that way? Do we have to do it that way? Does it have to look that way? What do we currently believe to be true about something? You don't, unless you actually focus on that, you don't really give much thought to that. What are assumptions about certain things? What changes could we make if that were not true, if we could reverse those laws? So the example that you can see here is a burger. So, our assumption is that the burger patty will always be inside the burger bun, but does that have to be the case? So, the bright spark that came up with putting cheese inside the crust of a pizza, for example, was clearly thinking that no, cheese doesn't have to be on top of the pizza. We can break that law. We can make a different assumption here. So identify, how could you accomplish each broken assumption? What assumptions do you make about things? How could we change that? Okay, and then another one, great minds or brain shifter. I think this is kind of a funny one, but again, something that can be quite easy to do. So consider the problem through the eyes of someone else. It doesn't have to be a superhero, but it could be. So what new perspective would they bring to it? So rather than, you sitting with perhaps your assumptions already made, or your thinking around something being quite static. Right, so what would it be different if a child was thinking about it? What new perspective would a child bring to it? Something entirely different, I would assume. So you could come up with a generic term, like a generic thing like any child, or it could be a 7-year-old boy. What would they think about it? What would Superman do? What would Superman think about it? Walt Disney, a few examples there, Greta Thunberg. It could even be a specific object. What would a cup do if we were asking it to do something different along these lines? And my new name of the moment, what would Marcus Rashford do? So, not that long back, there was a sort of craze for T-shirts, cushions, or whatever with what would such and such do. Insert the name that you like there, or your creative thinking role model of the moment. I think those two will do for me for now. But it's a good way to be thinking about, okay, if it wasn't me thinking about this, if it was somebody else, what would the difference be? Okay, so it's great minds. And then the last one I'm going to look at with you today is problem reversal. And that's basically about, again, trying to look at something differently. So say the example here is we have a factory where we make pencils, and we want to sell more pencils, obviously. Rather than just sort of getting together and thinking, right, well, how can we sell more pencils? What we might do is this reverse thinking or problem reversal. And we might think along the lines of, right, we want pencils that break as soon as you begin to use them, are uncomfortable to use, are unattractive to look at. We want people to use pens all the time instead of pencils. So that reverse thinking starts to get you creatively thinking about, well, actually, that's not what we want. But if we don't want that, then what do we want? What will be the difference that we can make now that we're not making at this point? Okay, so I think that's the last of our techniques there. There are lots of other ones. You've probably heard of things like 6 thinking hats. Again, there's lots of information out there about those things. These are sort of the simple ones that I wanted to get across to you today. But I do think that it's worth, if you're really interested in creative thinking, looking at, ways that you might feel more creative if you're doing that, because not all of these will work for all of you. You'll want to find ones that do work well for you. But you know what? When you get familiar with them, then you're probably going to want to try something different, because it's making that change and making that difference all the time that will keep you thinking creatively. Okay, so we've looked at opening your mind to creativity. We've looked at creative thinking tools. We're probably going to move on, I think, to the actual interview type questions. But before we do that, I want to give you what not to do. So if you want to stop being creative, want to stop thinking creatively, and of course that's not what I'm aiming for here today, do what you've always done. Don't challenge, don't take risks, don't make test your assumptions. Don't play or use your imagination. Stay focused all of the time. Don't ask questions. Make sure that you stick to the status quo. Only go with what's practical. Only believe that there's one answer. And don't try and do anything differently. So how to stop being creative. Dan, is there any questions before we move on to the actual interview questions?
No, Roshi, nothing specifically about the content as such. We did have a question about whether we'd be sharing the slides. I guess my response was that we're obviously recording the session, and I assume that it'll go onto the Career Service website.
Yeah, it'll certainly go into the meeting for now. We might not put the whole session on, but what I can do is I can put up some of the slides. If there's any in particular, certainly, that anybody wants, or if they want to email me as well, I can send it out to them. Okay. I'll try and put a summary sheet up for people. Okay.
That's all we have for now.
All right, grand. So just moving on then to, questions on creative thinking at interview. So when we're preparing for interview, I just want to remind you, if you've been in contact with any of our careers consultants before, you're probably aware of this STAR technique. But before we start to talk about interview questions, it's good to remember that whenever you're trying to frame your answers, it's a good way to be thinking about, keeping them nice and clear and concise for people. And, it's good to remember that whenever you go for an interview, there may have been 10 people in before you. People have listened to these answers a lot of times. So it's up to you to make them nice and clear for your interviewer. And just because things are clear in your head, they may not be for the interviewer. So using a format like this is a good way of making sure that things are concise and clear, and that you're saying what you want to be saying, basically. So look at what the, start by listening to the question properly, okay? Think of the example that you want to use, and my advice is always to prepare answers as best you can beforehand. Interviews are often not very original. You'll get asked the same questions over and over again, so make sure that you've got well prepared answers for those. And yes, of course, on the day you adjust them to suit the actual question you've been asked or the situation or the company that you're in, but always have answers prepared as best you can beforehand. So frame your answer then around the situation, task, action and result. Describe the event or situation that you were in. So what was happening at that time? Explain the task that you had to complete. What challenges perhaps were there? Describe the specific actions that you personally took to complete the task. Now, it's important that you say what you personally did. It's fine to say the team did this as well, but the interviewer will want to know what you actually did as well. And finish with the results then. What was the results of your actions? Were there benefits? Were there things like savings? What was the impact? Okay, so that's just a framework really to begin to practice your answers. And some of the questions then that you might get asked around creative thinking. And I want you to be aware, first of all, that, it's not terribly likely that they're going to use the words creative thinking. There might be some there, like what has been your most creative idea, but it's more likely that it's going to be around problem solving or around dealing with change. So the creative thinking from your point of view is something that helps you solve the answer. You don't necessarily have to talk about being creative as such. So, you're answering the question that you're asked, not the one that you think is in your head. So at the interview, you might be asked things like, tell me about a time when you used creative thinking to solve a problem. Now, it is about solving the problem there, but it's also about, well, how did you go about it? How did you begin to think about how you were going to solve that? And that, it could be involving a team situation, a product situation, a conflict that there was. It could be anything there. And I think it's important to remember that the problem doesn't have to be a huge one. It can be a small problem, insignificant in some ways. It's about how you went about doing it. Okay. Give me an example of when you have used creativity in a team or a group situation. And again, it could be something like, we were trying to come up with an idea for something, but we were very blocked. We couldn't think of anything to do. So we used a creative thinking technique like Scamper. Okay? It could be quite a specific way to be able to get in something like that. What has been your most creative idea? That'll be entirely up to you. But again, it doesn't have to be a huge thing. I think sometimes people get put off these sort of questions because they think it has to be a big deal. But it's about how you can talk about it, how you came to the idea, what your thinking around it was. Tell me about a time when you dealt with change or with changes. And I think this year is going to give you lots of examples because we've all had to deal with changes. We've all had to be creative in how we do it. I suppose it's just not about coming up with what everybody was doing, but what was personal to you. Another one then, our last one, give me an example of a time when you demonstrated flexibility in your approach to work or study. So again, personal to you, how did you go about changing things? I haven't used the word creative thinking or the words creative thinking in there because I want you to see that, being flexible, dealing with change, dealing with problem solving, they can be dealt with by thinking creatively, but you don't necessarily have to use those terms. Okay, so now I'm thinking that there could possibly be questions.
No, Roshi.
Happy enough?
We just want to pause for a minute to see if anyone wants to put anything in. Does anybody have any questions around these example interview questions specifically that they would like to ask?
You've got a careers consultant on with you now, so now's your chance.
I think you did a great job, Roshi.
Okay, folks. Well, you still have time to put in questions if you want, but just to give you some reminders here, if you will, please fill in the form in the chat to confirm your attendance at the event. You only have to do it once. If you've already done that, don't do it again. But any of you who came in late might still have to do that. So if you would, please. And also, Dan, if you haven't already, if you could put in the evaluation form also into the chat.
Yeah, I've just put that on, and I've put the attendance form on again because there were some people who joined a bit late and weren't able to access it originally. So the attendance form's in there and the evaluation form's there as well.
Okay, great. And as I said at the beginning to the evaluation form, there is a chance for you to win a £25 shopping voucher. So yes, it is a bribe from us to be able to get evaluations from you, but you know, it's worth your while as well. Okay, I'd said at the beginning that we were doing some short sessions on employability skills, and this is just the next few coming up basically. So working with customers and clients in January still, using your character strengths. That's a big favourite one of mine. I'm facilitating all of these, by the way. Talking about global citizenship on the 26th of February, impressing in meetings, and I think that's one that people don't necessarily think about when they're going for jobs. But believe you me, when you work in a company, you are forever in a meeting, so it's a good one to go to. Change and adaptability on the 24th of March, and then we're going to have 6 different sessions during development weeks from the 24th of May to the 4th of June. Okay, so again, any questions? And I shall stop sharing my screen.
No more questions, Roisin, but some really positive comments. It's nice to thank you all for your positive comments. I think everyone found it really useful and enjoyable and learned a lot from it. So that's really great feedback.
Good. That's good. Well, I'm going to put in a couple of pictures as well, just for people to be there with them. Because they have nothing to do in their evening, so I'm sure they'll want these as well. You can stop recording, Diane.